Before steel touched soil, before borders were drawn, there was a world, a continent alive with spirit, wisdom, and harmony. A world where people didn't try to conquer the land but listened to it. Where rivers were sacred trees, where elders and every heartbeat echoed the rhythm of the earth. Have you ever wondered what we lost when the world changed? Or what ancient wisdom still waits for us buried not in books, but in the land itself? Let's begin a journey not just through history, but through memory, through echoes, through truth. Long before highways carved through mountains, before skyscrapers rose to pierce the sky, the American continent was a breathtaking mosaic of civilizations. From the frozen tundras of the Arctic to the lush forests of the Amazon, this land was alive with nations, each with its language, customs, and a sacred connection to nature. These were not primitive peoples. These were wise, sophisticated societies that lived in profound alignment with the rhythms of the earth. To them, the world was not a resource, it was a relative. The rivers weren't just waterways, they were veins of the land. The animals were not prey, they were kin. The stars weren't distant balls of gas, they were guides, storytellers, and signs from the beyond. They studied the skies not to conquer the heavens, but to understand their place beneath them. They didn't build in defiance of nature, they built in conversation with it. Cities rose from rock and earth, so seamlessly woven into their surroundings, they looked as though they had grown there, not been constructed. In the central plains of North America, the Lakota followed the buffalo across vast grasslands. These great herds were more than a food source, they were sacred. Every part of the animal was used, nothing wasted, and ceremonies honored the life that was taken. Farther west, the ancestral Puebloans carved stone dwellings into cliff sides, cities suspended in time that still stand today. Their architecture wasn't just shelter, it was sacred geometry. Built in harmony with the sun and stars, each structure reflected the cosmos. In the northeast woodlands, the Haudenosaunee, also known as the people of the Longhouse, formed one of humanity's earliest models of democracy. Long before modern constitutions were drafted, 5, later 6 nations came together in peace. Their great law of peace emphasized unity, balance, and collective decision-making. They believed that no choice should be made without considering its impact on the next 7 generations. Far to the south, in the tropical forests of what is now Brazil and Paraguay, the Tupi-Guarani believed the forest was alive with spirit. To them, every tree had a presence, every mountain a guardian. Their myths were not stories, they were inherited truths passed down through generations like sacred breath. And in the icy extremes of the north, the Inuit built their lives in one of the harshest environments on Earth. But even there they found abundance. Their survival was not through domination, but through a deep respect for nature's patterns. They read the ice like others read scripture. These cultures did more than survive, they thrived. Sophisticated trade networks crisscrossed the continent. Obsidian from the Rocky Mountains ended up in eastern ceremonial sites. Shells from the Atlantic traveled deep into the plains. Goods moved, but so did ideas, stories, songs. This was connection before the word globalization even existed. But what unified them was something deeper than trade, a shared philosophy, a worldview rooted in interconnection. They didn't see themselves as separate from the earth, but as part of it. They didn't believe in ownership of the land. The land owned them, or perhaps more accurately, no one owned anything, all belonged to all. To colonizers, the continent may have looked like an untouched wilderness, but to the native peoples, it was a living library filled with knowledge, memory, and sacred balance. Where outsiders saw emptiness, they saw abundance. Where others saw conquest, they saw community. Let us not romanticize, these were not utopias free of conflict, but their systems of governance, spirituality, and ecology reflect a depth of understanding modern society still struggles to grasp. Among the Iroquois Confederacy, decisions were not made hastily. Leaders, often chosen by elder women, deliberated in councils until consensus was reached. Power wasn't taken, it was entrusted. In the Southwest, the Hopi maintained decentralized villages led by elder councils. These leaders were spiritual stewards, chosen not for dominance but for humility and wisdom. Major decisions were guided by rituals, dreams, and nature signs. The Lakota, living in mobile bands, made collective decisions during gatherings. Leadership was earned, not inherited, and even warriors' voices were weighed alongside those of elders. On the Pacific Northwest coast, tribes like the Tlingit and Haida created social systems structured by clans. These weren't just family lines, they were spiritual entities. Clan emblems, dances, songs, and feasts called potlatches shaped identity and social harmony. Through these grand ceremonies, wealth was shared, not hoarded. Status came not from accumulation, but from generosity. The common thread, a reverence for balance. Leadership was not power, it was responsibility. Decisions were not commands, they were offerings. And knowledge was not locked away, it was sung, danced, and told by firelight, generation after generation. In all of this, one truth shines brightly. These were complex, adaptive, and deeply spiritual civilizations. Civilizations rooted not in domination, but in reciprocity. They understood what many of us have forgotten, that to live well is to live with not above. One land, 1,000 nations. And a wisdom the world is finally beginning to hear again. This is the story of the indigenous peoples of the Americas, not as a footnote in history, but as guardians of a truth our modern world desperately needs, that we are not separate from this earth. We are the earth. We've glimpsed a world where life wasn't built in defiance of nature, but in deep partnership with it. A world shaped by wisdom, not warfare. That same ancient wisdom, though buried by centuries of conquest and modern noise, still pulses through the land, waiting to be remembered. At the heart of that wisdom was a way of life guided not by control, but by connection, especially the sacred bond between the physical and the spiritual. Among indigenous peoples across the Americas, spirituality wasn't something separate from life. It was life. It wasn't confined to temples or weekly rituals. It lived in the soil and the stars, in the breath of the wind, and in the quiet steps taken upon sacred ground. To them, the earth wasn't just a place to survive, it was a divine being, a living, breathing presence, a mother, a teacher, a spirit. The Lakota, for example, centered their spiritual worldview on Wakanj Thanka, often translated as the Great Spirit or the Great Mystery. This was not a singular God in the way many religions describe, but the collective force of all existence. Wakang Thangka was in the sunrise, in the rustling grass, and the thunder that rolled across the plains. Everything was connected by this sacred energy. Their sacred rituals were expressions of this connection. Take the sun dance, one of the most powerful ceremonies in Lakota tradition. Participants fasted and danced for hours, sometimes days, in a circle around the sacred tree. The ceremony represented sacrifice, devotion, and renewal. It was a physical, emotional, and spiritual offering, linking the dancer with the cosmic order and renewing the harmony between self-community and the universe. In the arid Southwest, the Hopi saw themselves as spiritual caretakers of the earth. They believed their duty was to maintain balance between the material and spiritual worlds. Through elaborate ceremonies led by Kachinas, spirit beings who embodied the elements, animals, and ancestors, the Hopi danced to summon rain, encourage harvests, and bring prosperity. Every mask worn during ritual, every step taken in sacred dance was infused with reverence. These ceremonies weren't just performances, they were prayers in motion. And in the lush rainforests of South America, the Tupi-Guarani held a vision of Terrasim Mal, the land without evil. This was not just a mythical place, but a spiritual state, one of purity, harmony, and closeness to the divine. Through song dance and the guided use of sacred plants like ayahuasca, they sought visions to heal, to guide, and to connect. Shamans served as spiritual navigators, guiding communities through dreamscapes and divine messages received in altered states of consciousness. For them, healing was never just physical. It was a realignment of the soul with the natural world. The indigenous peoples of the Northwest Coast, such as the Haida, expressed their spirituality through breathtaking visual storytelling. Their towering totem poles were not mere decorations, but sacred monuments. Every figure carved into wood told a story of ancestry, of creation, of spiritual guardianship. These carvings weren't just art. They were maps of lineage, symbols of sacred responsibility, and tributes to the divine forces that shaped their world. But spirituality was never limited to ceremonies or monuments. It was present in the everyday. Before hunting, a prayer was whispered to the animal spirit. Before planting, songs were sung to the soil. Even lighting a fire was done with reverence, acknowledging the sacred spark within flame. Healing, too, was deeply spiritual. Shamans, often called medicine men or women, were regarded as bridges between worlds. They treated illness not as isolated symptoms, but as signs of spiritual disharmony. Through chants, drumming, and medicinal plants, they guided the sick back into balance, not just with their bodies, but with their ancestors, their land, and their purpose. These practices weren't relics of superstition. They were expressions of deep intuitive knowledge. And they raise an important question for us today. What if we lived in a world where every action was sacred, where every word, every meal, every breath was a moment of communion? This philosophy, rooted in respect, awareness, and harmony, was more than spiritual belief. It was a guiding principle for life. At its core was the idea of interdependence, that nothing exists in isolation. That every leaf, every bird, every gust of wind is connected in a vast sacred web. This wasn't metaphor. It was lived reality. In the Great Plains, the Lakota expressed this truth through the phrase, Mitakuye Oyasinj, all my relations. This wasn't just about human family. It meant every being, animal, tree, stone, storm was kin. To harm one thread in the web was to weaken the whole. This belief shaped every decision. When hunting, no part of the animal was wasted. Bones, skin, meat, and spirit were all honored. The act of taking life was met with ceremonies of gratitude. The earth provided and the people responded with respect. For the Hopi, interdependence was seen most clearly in their relationship with water. Living in a desert climate, they understood that survival was not achieved through dominance, but through sacred partnership. Rituals were performed to invite the rain, not demand it. Seeds were planted with prayer, not just plows. They knew that without the earth's cooperation, nothing could thrive. And so they lived in alignment with nature's rhythms, planting, harvesting, and sharing with gratitude. This sense of connection extended not only across space, but through time. To many native nations, time was cyclical. The past was not gone, it lived in stories in stone and soil. And the future was not distant, it was shaped by every decision made today. Among the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, this was formalized into their decision-making. No major choice could be made without considering its impact on the next 7 generations. This wasn't idealism, it was duty. Responsibility was shared, not avoided. In every village, every member had a role. Children learned through doing. Elders were honored as wisdom keepers. There was no waste, not in materials, not in people. Whether you hunted, wove, healed, taught, or told stories, your gift mattered. The entire community was an ecosystem. Survival was not a solo mission, it was a symphony of contribution. And so from the forest to the plains, from the mountains to the coastlines, the native peoples of the Americas lived a truth that modern society has long forgotten. We are not separate. We are part of everything. We breathe the same air that flowed through the lungs of those who came before. We walk upon lands shaped by their prayers. And their wisdom calls us still, not in words, but in the wind. We've seen how indigenous peoples wove spirituality, balance, and interdependence into every aspect of their lives. Their wisdom wasn't just sacred, it was practical. It wasn't just about believing in harmony, it was about living it. But what happens when a way of life rooted in connection collides with a force driven by conquest? The teachings of Native American civilizations reveal a powerful truth that caring for each other and for the earth isn't simply a moral ideal, it's a matter of survival. A world without empathy and balance begins to unravel. And in today's fractured society, where disconnection, greed, and individualism dominate, perhaps it's time we return to the wisdom of the past. Because they understood something many of us have forgotten: everything is connected. But that sacred connection was violently disrupted. With the arrival of European colonizers, indigenous peoples across the Americas faced an onslaught that would last for centuries. Their lands weren't just taken, they were desecrated. Forests were cut down, rivers polluted, sacred spaces defiled. Entire ecosystems, both natural and cultural, were dismantled. And yet perhaps the greatest damage wasn't done to the land, but to identity. Languages that carried ancient stories were silenced. Dances and rituals once performed to honor the spirit of the earth were outlawed. The songs that once spoke to the stars, to the ancestors, and to the soil were buried under the weight of colonization. The colonizers didn't just invade, they tried to erase. In the 19th century, a calculated and systematic effort to wipe out indigenous identity was put into motion. Government policies in the United States and Canada established boarding schools with one chilling goal: kill the Indian, save the man. Native children were taken from their families, stripped of their clothing, their hair, their names. They were punished for speaking their native languages, forbidden from practicing their ceremonies, taught to be ashamed of their heritage. But even in silence, the spirit endured. In whispered prayers and secret stories told by firelight, in songs sung beneath the breath, tradition survived. Elders passed knowledge down through quiet resistance. Sacred rituals continued underground. The culture lived on, not in the open, but in the hearts of those who refused to forget. Among the Lakota, the sun dance never disappeared completely. Even under the threat of imprisonment, or worse, some communities found ways to keep it alive. And today that ceremony has become a radiant symbol of cultural resilience. It speaks not just of suffering, but of renewal. It is proof that no matter how deep the wound, the spirit can still rise. The Hopi too carried their prophecies forward, warnings not just for their own people, but for all of humanity. These ancient messages foretold of imbalance, disconnection, and a world that would suffer for abandoning its sacred responsibilities. And look around: rising temperatures, poisoned waters, vanishing forests. Their warnings weren't myths, they were instructions. Yet with warning came hope. The Hopi teach that healing is still possible, but only if we remember our place in the web of life, only if we restore balance, only if we act not as masters of the earth, but as caretakers. Today, their voices echo in climate movements, in the struggle for environmental justice, in the fight to protect what little untouched land remains. What once was dismissed as primitive has become prophetic. And so the question remains, will we listen? The wisdom of indigenous peoples is not a relic. It is a guide, a compass pointing us back toward balance. It teaches us that true progress is not found in domination, but in stewardship. Not in endless consumption, but in sacred reciprocity. Their legacy invites us to look inward. How do we live? What do we value, and at what cost? Because as these ancient cultures have long reminded us, what we do to the earth, we do to ourselves. That is not poetry. That is prophecy. The ancestral teachings of the original peoples of the Americas are not lost. They live on in ceremonies, in language revival, in environmental activism, in the hearts of indigenous youth reclaiming their power, and in the quiet strength of elders who carry centuries of memory. Their resilience teaches us something sacred, that no matter how much is taken, the soul cannot be stolen. Culture can be hidden, but it cannot be erased. This is not just a story of what was, it is a story of what still can be. A story that calls each of us to remember that harmony is not behind us, it's ahead of us if we choose to walk that path. So let us listen, let us learn, let us honor. Because the earth is not asking us to conquer it, it's asking us to come home.